17 sentries. That's how many armed men stood between Paddy Mayne and the aircraft he'd come to destroy. 17 German soldiers posted on or beside nearly every plane on the airfield at Fuka, each one carrying a rifle, each one alert, each one scanning the darkness for exactly the kind of man who was crawling toward them through the North African night. He didn't have a platoon behind him. He didn't have air support overhead. He didn't call in an airstrike. He didn't even use his firearm. He used a knife. One man, one blade, 17 sentries. And by the time the sun rose over the Libyan desert, not a single one of them was still breathing, and the aircraft they'd been assigned to protect were burning wreckage scattered across the sand. When Major General David Lloyd Owen greeted Mayne at the rendezvous afterward and asked how things had gone, Mayne's reply was 5 words that would become one of the most quietly terrifying statements in the history of special operations. "A bit trickier tonight," Owen pressed him. What did he mean? Mayne explained, almost as an afterthought, that the Germans had posted a sentry on nearly every aircraft. He'd had to knife them before he could place the bombs. Owen later recalled asking how many sentries Mayne had killed. The answer came back without inflection, without drama, without the faintest trace of boastfulness. 17. Had Owen not asked, the incident would have been recorded as just another night's work for the SAS. Mayne never mentioned it again. That is the story of the man who canceled the airstrike before it was ever needed. Not with a radio call to a bomber squadron circling overhead. Not with a laser designator painting a target for a precision-guided munition. But with a Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife and the kind of calculated, clinical aggression that no military academy on earth has ever been able to teach. The man who made that night possible was not born to war. He was born to Newtownards, County Down, in the north of Ireland, on the 11th of January, 1915. Robert Blair Mayne grew up the 6th of 7 children in a prosperous Presbyterian family that ran several retail businesses across the county. His father was a merchant. His mother was devout. The family home was comfortable, respectable, and thoroughly unremarkable in the landscape of early 20th century Ulster. Nothing about the Mayne household suggested it would produce one of the most decorated and dangerous soldiers in British military history. But there were signs. From an early age, the boy they called Blair possessed a physical presence that set him apart from every room he entered. By the time he reached Queen's University Belfast to study law, he stood 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighed approximately 240 pounds. He was not merely large. He was explosively powerful, the kind of man whose handshake could make another man wince, and whose temper, when it surfaced, could clear a room faster than a grenade. He channeled that physicality into sport with devastating effect. He became the Irish University's heavyweight boxing champion. He played rugby union at the highest level, earning 6 international caps for Ireland and being selected for the 1938 British and Irish Lions tour to South Africa. Teammates from that tour remembered 2 things about Paddy Mayne. First, he was the standout player in 17 of 30 provincial matches. Second, he had a habit of smashing up hotel rooms and fighting dock workers in port towns for recreation. He was a qualified solicitor. He wrote poetry. He was known for long periods of brooding silence broken by sudden outbursts of volcanic aggression that left colleagues, commanding officers, and occasionally innocent bystanders wondering whether they had just encountered a genius or a maniac. The answer, as the deserts of North Africa would soon demonstrate, was both. When war came in 1939, Mayne volunteered immediately. He received a commission in the Royal Artillery before transferring to the Royal Ulster Rifles and then to 11 Commando, one of the new raiding units Winston Churchill had demanded following the evacuation at Dunkirk. Churchill wanted a force that could, in his words, pursue a butcher and bolt policy against the enemy. Mayne was precisely the kind of man the butchers were looking for. He saw his first action in June 1941 at the Battle of the Litani River in Lebanon, fighting Vichy French forces. He distinguished himself, taking prisoners and leading his section with a calm ferocity that earned him a mention in dispatches. But it was what happened after the battle that would alter the trajectory of his life, and ultimately the trajectory of the war itself. Mayne had a grudge against a fellow officer, Major Charles Napier, who had not taken part in the Litani raid and who, according to members of the unit, had shot Mayne's pet dog while Mayne was away on operations. The incident enraged Mayne beyond the boundaries of military discipline. One evening in the officers' mess on Cyprus, after consuming a considerable quantity of alcohol, Mayne found Napier and knocked him unconscious with a single blow. Some accounts say it was his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Jeffrey Keyes, who received the punch. The historical record is disputed. What is not disputed is that Paddy Mayne was facing disciplinary action that could have ended his military career before it properly began. And that is when David Stirling found him. Lieutenant David Stirling of the Scots Guards was a man whose biography reads like it was written by a novelist with an excessive imagination. Born into Scottish aristocracy, tall, languid, and possessed of a confidence that bordered on delusion, Stirling had arrived in North Africa as part of the commando group known as Lay Force. He found conventional military operations tedious and most of his commanding officers incompetent. While recuperating from a parachute injury that had temporarily paralyzed him from the waist down, he conceived an idea that would change warfare forever. Stirling's reasoning was elegant in its simplicity. The British were launching large commando raids against Axis targets in North Africa with hundreds of men, ships, and aircraft. Most of the force was consumed with its own protection. Only a fraction actually engaged the enemy. The operations were expensive, cumbersome, and achieved results that rarely justified the resources expended. Stirling proposed the opposite. Small teams of 4 or 5 highly trained men, inserted behind enemy lines by parachute or ground transport, could attack targets that the enemy considered safe: airfields, supply dumps, communication lines. The soft underbelly of Rommel's Africa Corps, which stretched across hundreds of miles of desert, with supply lines so long and so exposed that a handful of saboteurs could cause devastation completely disproportionate to their numbers. He smuggled a memorandum past the sentries at Middle East headquarters in Cairo, talked his way into the office of the Deputy Chief of Staff, Major General Neil Ritchie, and within weeks had been authorized to form a new unit. It was designated L Detachment, Special Air Service Brigade. The name was a deliberate deception, designed to convince Axis intelligence that the British had an entire airborne brigade operating in the theater. In reality, the unit consisted of 5 officers and 60 other ranks. It was the smallest formation in the British Army. It would become the most consequential. Stirling needed men who were capable of operating alone in the most hostile environments on Earth, men who could navigate featureless desert by the stars, kill silently at close range, destroy aircraft with improvised explosives, and march 40 miles through sand, carrying their own water and ammunition without complaint or collapse. He needed men whose temperament was unsuited to conventional military discipline, but perfectly calibrated for the controlled chaos of guerrilla warfare behind enemy lines. He needed Paddy Mayne. The two men were opposites in almost every respect. Stirling was aristocratic, charming, a natural diplomat who could talk generals into supporting operations that sounded insane. Mayne was working class, volatile, a man who punched officers and broke hotel furniture and communicated primarily through long silences and sudden violence. But Stirling recognized something in Mayne that transcended their differences. He recognized a born warrior, a man whose physical gifts, psychological constitution, and capacity for cold, calculated aggression made him the ideal instrument for the kind of warfare Stirling was about to invent. Mayne accepted the invitation. He was extracted from whatever disciplinary process was pending and delivered to a 3-tent camp at Kabrit, 100 miles south of Cairo, where L Detachment SAS was coming to life in the desert heat. The training was brutal and innovative in equal measure. There were no precedents, no manual, no established doctrine, Stirling, Mayne, and Lieutenant Jock Lewis, an Australian scholar and Oxford rowing blue who became the unit's intellectual architect, invented their methods from scratch. Parachute training was conducted from moving trucks and a scaffolding rig of dubious structural integrity. Navigation exercises covered hundreds of miles of featureless desert. Weapons training emphasized instinctive shooting at close range because the SAS would operate in darkness against targets measured in feet, not hundreds of yards. And Lewis, working with captured Italian explosives and whatever materials he could scavenge, invented a device that would become one of the most effective sabotage weapons of the war. The Lewis bomb weighed approximately 1 pound. It combined plastic explosive with thermite, creating a device that would not merely detonate, but burn with an intensity sufficient to ignite aviation fuel and melt engine components. A single Lewis bomb placed on the wing of an aircraft could destroy the entire plane. It was light enough for a man to carry a dozen of them in his pack alongside his water, ammunition, and rations. It was the perfect weapon for the perfect mission. Small teams, silent approach, maximum destruction. Vanish into the desert before dawn. The first test of this concept came on the night of the 16th of November, 1941. Operation Squatter. It was a catastrophe. 54 men of L Detachment parachuted into the desert in support of Operation Crusader, the 8th Army's offensive to relieve the siege of Tobruk. They were supposed to land near the coast and attack Axis airfields at Gazala and Timimi. Instead, they jumped into one of the worst storms the region had seen in 30 years. Wind speeds exceeded what any parachute operation could survive. Men were scattered across miles of desert. Equipment containers vanished into the darkness. Some men were dragged across the ground by their parachutes, unable to release their harnesses. Some were killed on impact. Some were captured. Not a single enemy aircraft was destroyed. Of the 54 men who jumped, only 21 made it back to friendly lines, collected by patrols of the long-range desert group. The SAS should have died that night. It should have been written off as another failed experiment by another eccentric officer with more ambition than judgment. But Stirling refused to let it end. He learned the critical lesson that Operation Squatter taught. Parachute insertion in the desert was unreliable. The long-range desert group, who had picked up his survivors, could deliver his teams to their targets far more effectively by ground. And he had one other advantage that no amount of bad luck could erase. He had Paddy Mayne. Less than a month after the disaster of Operation Squatter, Mayne led a small team against the Italian airfield at Wadi Tamet on the Libyan coast, midway between Tripoli and Benghazi. The date was the 14th of December, 1941. The raid would prove that everything Stirling had theorized was correct, and it would do so in a manner so spectacular that the future of the SAS was secured in a single night. The LRDG transported Mayne's team across the desert in their battered Chevrolet trucks, navigating by sun compass and the stars across terrain that appeared on maps as empty space. The journey took days. The conditions were miserable, freezing at night, burning by day, and at no point comfortable. When they reached the area near Tamet, the SAS men dismounted and made their approach on foot, creeping through the darkness toward an airfield where approximately 30 German and Italian aircraft sat in neat rows on the sand. The base was shut down for the night. In the wooden building that served as the officers' mess, roughly 30 German and Italian airmen were socializing, eating, drinking, playing cards. Utterly unaware that the most dangerous man on the North African continent was approximately 200 yards away, moving through the darkness with his Colt .45 pistol and a canvas bag full of Lewis bombs. What happened next entered the mythology of special operations warfare and has never left it. Mayne approached the officers' mess. He could see light leaking beneath the door. He could hear voices, laughter, the clink of glasses. He kicked the door open and stood in the entrance, filling the frame with his massive silhouette. Flanking him were two of his men, carrying Thompson submachine guns. The room froze. Approximately 30 enemy airmen stared at the apparition in the doorway. Bearded, filthy, wild-eyed, armed. Mayne later described the moment with his characteristic economy of language. He said he told them good evening. Then a young German officer stood and began to move. Mayne shot him with the Colt. Then he shot the man nearest to him. His companions opened fire with the Thompsons. The room became a slaughterhouse. Mayne did not linger. He and his men burst out of the mess and scattered across the airfield. Over the next hours, they moved from aircraft to aircraft, placing Lewis bombs on wings and fuselages, shooting out cockpit instruments on planes they couldn't reach with explosives. By the time they withdrew into the desert, 24 aircraft had been destroyed, along with fuel tanks, an ammunition dump, and a line of telegraph poles. This attack also produced one of the most legendary images in SAS history. Mayne, having run out of Lewis bombs before running out of targets, walked up to a parked aircraft, reached into the cockpit, and ripped out the instrument panel with his bare hands. The Herculean act became one of the founding legends of the regiment. The Tamet raid saved the SAS. As Sterling himself later acknowledged, the haul was so impressive that headquarters would have been foolish to disband the unit, and Mayne was just getting started. 2 weeks later, on the 27th of December, Mayne returned to Tamet with 5 men and destroyed another 27 aircraft. The Italians had strengthened their defenses. Mayne noted in his report that the enemy had placed sentries in groups of 7, spaced roughly 30 feet apart across the airfield perimeter. But it was Christmas. The sentries were complacent. Perhaps they did not believe that any raider would risk his life on the night before Christ's birth. They were wrong. Mayne slipped past them like a shadow, planted his bombs, and withdrew before the first detonation turned the Libyan night orange. Over the following months, Mayne led raid after raid across the Libyan and Egyptian desert, attacking airfields at Birka, Baghush, El Daba, and Fuka with a relentlessness that bordered on the obsessive. At Birka in March 1942, his team destroyed 15 aircraft, along with petrol dumps and 12 large torpedo bombs. The night sky over the Benghazi plain glowed with the fires they set. At Baghush, on the night of the 7th of July, Mayne and just 3 men blew up 22 aircraft with plastic explosives, but Mayne was furious because he had sabotaged 40 aircraft and some of the primers had been damp. Rather than accept the result, he and Sterling charged their jeeps back onto the airfield and opened up with their newly mounted Vickers K machine guns, firing 1,200 rounds per minute per gun, ripping through the remaining aircraft while stunned German ground crews ran for cover. They destroyed 12 more planes in that second pass. On the 18th of September 1940, Wing Commander Douglas Bader and his squadrons had made international headlines by downing 30 German planes in a single day during the Battle of Britain. Mayne and his men destroyed 34 in a single night at Baghush. Nobody outside the immediate area took any notice. His personal tally of enemy aircraft destroyed climbed past 100, a number that exceeded the combat record of any Allied fighter ace in the war. On one night alone, his team accounted for 47 grounded aircraft. The SAS were destroying more planes on the ground than the Royal Air Force was shooting down in the air, and they were doing it with teams of 4 or 5 men armed with homemade bombs, personal weapons, and whatever vehicles they could beg, borrow, or steal from other units. The acquisition of American Willys Jeeps in the summer of 1942 had transformed SAS tactics. Mayne was among the first to recognize their potential. The Jeeps were nimble, fast, and perfect for the desert. He had Vickers K machine guns, salvaged from obsolete aircraft, bolted onto pivot mounts, turning each Jeep into a mobile gun platform capable of devastating firepower. The SAS no longer needed to creep onto airfields by stealth alone. They could drive onto them in formation, guns blazing, and drive off again before the enemy could mount a coherent defense. The raids at Fuka in July 1942 represent the pinnacle of Mayne's individual lethality and the moment that the title of this story comes into focus. By the summer of 1942, the Germans had recognized the threat posed by SAS raiders and had significantly strengthened security around their airfields. Guard posts were increased, perimeter patrols were established, and sentries were posted directly on or beside the parked aircraft so that any saboteur who attempted to plant explosives would have to deal with an armed soldier at point-blank range before he could reach his target. This was the countermeasure that should have ended the SAS's airfield campaign. An airstrike by conventional bombers was the logical response. Send in the RAF, carpet bomb the field from altitude, accept the collateral damage, and move on. That was the approach the war's logistics demanded. That was what the planners would have recommended. But Mayne was not a planner. He was a door kicker. And on the night of the Fuka raid, he made a calculation that no planning cell in any military headquarters would have sanctioned. He would go in on foot, alone, in the darkness. And he would remove the sentries by hand, one at a time, silently, with a knife, so that his men could follow behind him and plant their bombs undisturbed. The Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife, standard issue to British commandos and SAS personnel, was a double-edged stiletto designed specifically for close-quarters killing. It was approximately 11 inches long with a 7-inch blade tapered to a needle point, balanced for both thrusting and throwing. It was not a survival tool. It was not a utility blade. It was a weapon designed for one purpose: silent elimination of enemy personnel at intimate range. Mayne knew how to use it. Every SAS operator trained extensively in close-quarters combat, including knife fighting and silent killing techniques, drawn from the methods developed by William Fairbairn and Eric Sykes, two former Shanghai municipal police officers who had codified the art of close combat killing into a systematic discipline taught to commandos and special forces throughout the war. But technique alone does not explain what happened that night at Fuka. Technique can teach you where to place the blade. It can teach you how to control a man's body as the life leaves it, how to prevent him from crying out, how to lower him to the ground without noise. What technique cannot teach is the psychological constitution required to do this not once, not twice, but 17 times in succession across the dark expanse of an enemy airfield, knowing that each kill increases the probability of detection, knowing that each sentry who fails to report might trigger an alarm, knowing that one mistake, one sound, one stumble on the uneven ground will bring every gun on the field to bear on a single man with nothing but a knife. Mayne moved from aircraft to aircraft through the darkness. Each sentry was a separate problem. Each one required its own approach. Some were standing, some were sitting. Some were leaning against the landing gear of their assigned aircraft. Each one had to be reached unseen, engaged in absolute silence, and neutralized before he could fire his weapon or shout a warning. The distances between the planes varied. The terrain was open desert, flat and exposed, with minimal cover between aircraft dispersal points. Mayne would have crawled between positions on his belly, using the aircraft themselves and whatever scrub or equipment littered the field as concealment, timing his movements to the rhythm of the night, waiting for the wind, waiting for a distant engine noise, waiting for anything that might mask the soft sound of a man moving through sand. 17 times he closed the distance. 17 times he committed the act. 17 times he controlled the aftermath, easing the body down, checking that the noise hadn't carried, recovering his composure, and moving to the next aircraft. The physical exertion alone would have been immense. Each kill required explosive power delivered with surgical precision. Each approach required the cardiovascular discipline of a man moving silently while his heart rate must have been demanding far more oxygen than controlled breathing could provide. The psychological weight multiplied with every sentry. The first kill is shock. The 5th is endurance. The 10th is something that psychologists do not have a word for. The 17th is a place where only a handful of human beings in the history of warfare have ever been. When the sentries were dealt with, Mayne's team moved in and planted their explosives. The airfield was destroyed. The Lewis bombs detonated in sequence, igniting fuel and ammunition. The aircraft that Rommel needed to support his advance toward Egypt, the aircraft that the RAF was struggling to match in the skies over the western desert, were reduced to burning metal and molten glass on the sand. And Mayne walked back into the desert as if he had done nothing more than take an evening stroll. When Lloyd Owen asked him about it afterward, the exchange lasted fewer than 30 seconds. A bit trickier tonight. The casual understatement of a man for whom killing 17 enemy soldiers with a knife was a logistical complication, not a defining experience. He never mentioned it again. Had the question not been asked, the 17 sentries would have disappeared into the desert alongside their burned aircraft, their deaths unrecorded, their killer unnamed. The Fuka raid was not an anomaly. It was the purest expression of a principle that defined the SAS from its inception and that remains the foundation of British Special Forces doctrine to this day. The principle is this: the weapon is the man, not the rifle, not the bomb, not the helicopter or the drone or the satellite. The man, his training, his experience, his judgment, his capacity to endure discomfort and fear and moral weight without degradation of performance. Everything else is a tool. The man is the weapon. That principle produced staggering results across the North African campaign. Between late 1941 and the end of 1942, the SAS destroyed over 400 Axis aircraft on the ground. They wrecked fuel dumps, ammunition stores, communication lines, and transport vehicles across a theater that stretched from Egypt to Tunisia. They forced the Germans and Italians to divert thousands of troops to rear area security, troops that were desperately needed at the front, where Rommel's Africa Corps was locked in a seesaw battle with the British Eighth Army. Rommel himself referred to the SAS raiders as a menace that required a disproportionate response. The German commander understood what his superiors in Berlin did not. The damage was not merely material, it was psychological. Every German and Italian airman in North Africa went to sleep knowing that somewhere in the desert, small teams of British saboteurs were moving toward them through the darkness. Every pilot who walked to his aircraft at dawn did so wondering whether the landing gear had been rigged with explosives during the night. The SAS attacks on airfields proved essential to early British offensives in the western desert. It was more economical in terms of available resources to destroy enemy aircraft on the ground than to fight them in the air, particularly when German Messerschmitt 109 fighters were far superior to the overworked Hurricanes and obsolete biplanes that the RAF's Desert Air Force was struggling to keep airborne. The greatest of those airfield raids came at Sidi Hanaish on the night of the 26th of July, 1942, when Mayne and Sterling led 18 armed jeeps carrying British and French commandos directly onto the airfield in a V formation. The Luftwaffe had parked dozens of aircraft at Sidi Hanaish. The jeeps tore through them in two columns, guns mounted on pivots, each vehicle firing at everything on its designated side. The night erupted into a wall of tracer fire and detonating fuel tanks. They destroyed up to 40 German aircraft and escaped into the desert with the loss of only 3 jeeps and 2 men killed in action. It was the most spectacular single raid of the entire desert campaign, and it demonstrated that the SAS was no longer just a sabotage outfit. It was a mobile striking force capable of delivering devastating blows deep behind enemy lines and vanishing before the enemy could respond. And at the center of that destruction stood Paddy Mayne, personally responsible for more enemy aircraft destroyed than any fighter pilot on either side of the war. He received the Distinguished Service Order for the first Tamet raid. He would go on to receive 3 more bars to the DSO, making him one of the most decorated British soldiers of the entire conflict. He took command of the SAS after Sterling was captured by the Germans in January 1943 in Tunisia. Sterling's capture was almost farcical in its circumstances. His patrol was surprised while sleeping in a wadi. They had posted no sentries. A German paratrooper named Heinrich Fugner later remarked how easy it had been. The Phantom Major, who had evaded the enemy for over a year across thousands of miles of desert, was taken because on that particular night nobody was watching. He spent the rest of the war in prisoner-of-war camps, escaping and being recaptured multiple times. Command of the SAS fell to Mayne, who led the regiment through Sicily, Italy, France, the Low Countries, and into Germany itself. His final act of documented heroism came on the 9th of April, 1945, near Oldenburg in northern Germany. 2 SAS squadrons advancing ahead of the Canadian 4th Armored Division were ambushed by German paratroopers. The lead officer, Major Dick Bond, was killed. SAS troopers were pinned in a ditch under heavy fire. Mayne, who as the regiment's commanding officer had been ordered not to lead operations in the field, ignored the order and drove to the scene. He took command of a jeep, positioned a volunteer gunner on the rear-mounted Vickers, and drove directly into the ambush. He raked the enemy-held farm buildings with fire from a Bren gun, clearing them room by room. Then he drove his jeep up and down the road, alongside the ditch where his men lay trapped, drawing enemy fire onto himself while his gunner suppressed the German positions. On his final pass, he jumped from the jeep and began physically dragging his wounded men from the ditch and loading them into the vehicle. He was recommended for the Victoria Cross. Field Marshal Montgomery signed the citation. The award was downgraded to a 4th DSO by anonymous bureaucrats in Whitehall, a decision that has been debated and contested for 80 years. King George VI himself remarked that the Victoria Cross had so strangely eluded Mayne. David Sterling called the decision a monstrous injustice. As recently as April 2025, the issue was raised again in the House of Commons, with the Veterans Minister pledging a full review of the case. Mayne survived the war. He did not survive the peace. The man who had crawled across enemy airfields in the dark killed 17 sentries with a knife, destroyed over 100 aircraft, and led the SAS through 4 years of the most intense special operations in military history, returned to Newtownards, and tried to resume his career as a solicitor. He could not do it. The back injuries he sustained during the war left him in chronic pain. He struggled with what would today be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. He drank heavily. He fought when he drank. The world that had needed his gifts was gone, and the world that remained had no place for them. On the night of the 14th of December, 1955, exactly 14 years to the day after his first raid on Tamet, Paddy Mayne was killed when his car struck a parked vehicle and then a telegraph pole in the early hours of the morning. He was 40 years old. He was driving home from a night of drinking with a fellow Freemason. He never married. He had no children. He is buried at Movia Cemetery in Newtownards, where a statue stands in the town square of the man who was too big for the town and too damaged for the world that existed after the war that made him. The SAS that Mayne helped build went on to become the most renowned Special Forces unit on the planet. Reconstituted in 1947 as a territorial Army regiment before being reformed as the regular 22 Special Air Service Regiment, the unit carried the principles that Sterling conceived and Mayne perfected into every conflict Britain fought for the next 8 decades. Malaya, where 4-man patrols spent weeks in deep jungle dismantling communist guerrilla networks. Oman, where a handful of SAS soldiers defeated a Soviet-backed insurgency that threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz. Borneo, Northern Ireland, the Falklands, the Iranian embassy siege of 1980, where a single squadron ended a 6-day hostage crisis in 11 minutes of controlled violence, broadcast live to a watching world. Iraq, where Task Force Black conducted over 1,000 raids in Baghdad. Afghanistan, where SAS patrols operated in mountains that had defeated the Soviet Army. The 4-man patrol, the silent approach, the knife before the gun, the man before the machine. These are the building blocks of a doctrine that has been adopted and adapted by Special Operations Forces in every Western military. The American Delta Force, the Australian SASR, The French 1st Marine Infantry Parachute Regiment. All of them trace their lineage, their methods, and their philosophy back to a 3-tent camp in the Egyptian desert, where a Scottish aristocrat and an Irish solicitor decided to change the rules of war. But all of it traces back to a specific moment, a specific night, a specific man on his belly in the desert sand, blade in hand, closing the distance to a German sentry who had no idea that the most dangerous soldier in North Africa was already within arm's reach. Cancel the airstrike. Paddy Mayne is going in alone. And by the time the bombers could have reached the target, there would be nothing left to bomb. Just burning wreckage, 17 bodies, and a set of footprints leading back into the darkness of the desert that made him and the silence that followed him all the way home to Newtownards, where he rests now beneath the same Irish soil that raised him, the bravest man never to win the Victoria Cross, the man who needed nothing but a knife and the nerve to use it, and the soldier who proved once and for all that the most sophisticated weapon in any theater of war is not the one you carry in your hand. It's the one you carry between your ears. That is the legacy. That is the lesson. And that is why, when a man like Paddy Mayne walks onto the battlefield, you cancel the airstrike, because he's already done the job.